Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name's George Perkovich. I'm a Vice President for Studies here at the Carnegie Endowment. It's my pleasure to welcome you. And is the mic on? I think it's on, but maybe people in the back are nodding. All right, good. I'll speak loudly, or as loudly as I can. It's a great pleasure to welcome Natasha Bertrand, who will be our moderator today. Natasha is a staff writer for The Atlantic and a frequent contributor for NBC News and MSNBC News. She covers national security issues and issues related to the intelligence community and others that are relevant to our discussion here today. And then, of course, and a special pleasure for me to introduce Daniel Ellsberg. I was just saying to Dan, we first met in 1981, so a long time ago, and it was as a result of that and some other things, right, then I got interested in nuclear weapons policy. So I've been plagued by that experience for 37 years now, and was quite taken by Dan's memoir, which is outside his second memoir, The Doomsday Machine, because as we'll hear and as you can see as you read it, it's one of the most penetrating accounts of the nuclear enterprise that I've read. And some of the material is quite dated in its origin, but is still very, very relevant today. I want to say just a little bit by way of introducing Dan. I think many of the people in the room were around when the Pentagon Papers happened, and so know a fair amount of Dan's background, but I think many don't, and it didn't come out in the movie The Post, but Dan began as a Cold Warrior. He went to Harvard in the 1950s, and then after graduating, joined the Marine Corps, where he was an officer, and then after that came back to Harvard, and then went to work for the Rand Corporation, where he was very involved in thinking about the unthinkable, how to manage nuclear deterrence, primarily with the Soviet Union, and got deeply, deeply involved in nuclear strategy. He then completed his PhD in economics in 1962 at Harvard, and was very involved in game theory that was relevant to nuclear war planning. And as he recounts in The Doomsday Machine, from 59 till I guess it was about 64, worked very, very intensely on U.S. nuclear war planning, and became involved in and exposed to the depths of the system, many of which the president himself wasn't aware of. And then a part that I think a lot of younger people aren't aware of, in 1965, he went to Vietnam on behalf of the State Department and spent 2 years there. That is recounted in the first memoir, Secrets, which is a really, really brilliant book. If I were teaching, I would have it required reading in any core curriculum in any U.S. college. It's a rich history, it's a rich treatment of ethics, of government, of political science. I mean, it's a profound story. And some of it, a lot of it's derived from his spending time on the ground in Vietnam, driving into the unsecured provinces of the country where many U.S. officials, including the military, never, dared visit. And so he got this kind of ground reality to the situation, which became then ironic when the Pentagon Papers were released, and he was portrayed in certain ways as if he didn't know what he was talking about and didn't have that on-the-ground reality. But it is that sense of where operations really happen, whether it was Vietnam or in nuclear force planning, that I think Dan got his keenest insights. So I commend both books to you. What we thought we would have the discussion focus on today, though, was more on questions of government service and the dilemmas that come out in government service. And partly our motivation was thinking about today, when I think a lot of really fine people feel that they may have dilemmas as institutions are discredited, as the sense of government service is more problematic. To hear Dan ruminate on those experiences and what he has learned from them, I think is especially invaluable. So we're glad to have you. We're glad to have Natasha and Dan, and I will get out of the way and let the conversation begin. Thank you.
Is my microphone on?
Yeah, are these on? Can you hear? Yes? No, you can hear. In the back? Yes, okay.
So, as George said in his introduction, you were a Cold War nuclear planner. You spent 2 years in Vietnam driving through the provinces, visiting the most dangerous areas of Vietnam at that time, and then you became a whistleblower. So I wanted to start out the discussion asking you how that evolution occurred. How did you evolve between 1959 and 1968, and what was the final step for you in becoming a whistleblower?
Right, well, there were various stages, actually, in that, and I can almost answer the question by the first sentence of a review of my book that I just read today. My publisher sent it to me. It's from April 7th from the Montreal Gazette. That was when I turned 87, 3 days ago. And she sent me this review, Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And I want to read the first sentence of it. But first, let me ask her, this is an unusual audience for me, very, very welcome. I'm very happy to have an audience like this, and I can't remember when I have. It's been a long time ago, and not much since the Pentagon Papers. But let me ask her, how many people here are now currently employed by the executive branch? Are there any? I see 3 hands, 4. How many have been within the last 8 or 9 years? Right. And how many within the last year? Is Bossert here today? Or McMaster? Or, Tillerson, no. But I'm not going to ask how many have clearances, but already those are more hands than I've had a chance to talk to, and I would have liked to very much. I wish I were giving this talk in the Pentagon. In fact, I inquired whether the mall in the Pentagon, the concourse, still had a bookstore when I was there, and I'm told, because I love the thought of having a book talk in the Pentagon for my book. And apparently there isn't anymore. That's what I was told, unless you tell me otherwise. So this is the next best. But here is the first sentence. Question: what would you do if you were a young professional working at your dream job and you discovered your employer was lying to the public, promoting a disastrous foreign war, and steadily expanding a weapons program that threatened to destroy human life on Earth? Now, those of you who are working in the national security establishment right now may or may not recognize that sentence as applying to you right now, or in the last 8 years, or 10 years, or 15 years, in fact. You might or might not recognize it. I wouldn't have recognized it, let's say, 50 years ago. But it was a sentence applicable to me. And I would say, I'll just start by saying, I think there are thousands of people in the government right now looking at the prospects of war with North Korea and or Iran and or Syria, and are looking at the new nuclear posture review, who recognize that, like Obama's nuclear posture review, you are looking at plans for a doomsday machine, under some conditions and some circumstances, a system that would end most human life on Earth. And many who are working on those plans would not, any more than I did at a certain point. So I'm not pointing any fingers here by any means, but I'm sure there are people who do see it that way. So this is very relevant. And coming back then to your question, well, let me explain. In fact, let me, in response to your question, Natasha, say that the second sentence is a little misleading. It says, let's see if I can find it here again, a second. In 1971, that was the dilemma facing Daniel Ellsberg, young academic and consultant at the Rand Corporation, a Cold War think tank with close ties to the Air Force. Actually, that was not a dilemma that I faced for the first time in 1971. In 1964, on my first day in the Pentagon as a full-time employee, having been a consultant for years before that, but a first time, and I'll say for benefit of people here, Special Assistant to the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, a GS-18, the rank at which I came in. That I went to Vietnam as an FSR-1 in the State Department. My first day was August 4th, 1964, when we first, the end of the day, our morning in Vietnam, 12 time zones away, with the first 64 air sorties against North Vietnam, which beginning then in February of 65 led to almost 8 million tons of explosives being dropped on Indochina, or 4 times the tonnage of World War II, which was 2 million tons. The beginning then, on August 4th, my first day, I heard the president, LBJ, and my boss, Secretary McNamara, who was one step above my immediate boss, Assistant Secretary, saying to the public, this was a limited response to an unprovoked attack on destroyers carrying out a routine patrol in international waters, and we seek no wider war. This is a limited retaliation of the kind we're hearing that might be taking place right now, a limited retaliation in Syria, just an attack not on us, but a violation of international law of gas in Syria. The president was talking last night that he might, as early as Tuesday, carry that out. And so in August 4th in the morning, I was seeing the planning being done for that strike. By that evening, I was hearing the president say, and I'll say again, unprovoked attack, international waters, routine patrol, we seek no wider war. I knew already each of those statements was false. It did not occur to me to resign or to expose that. I had just signed one of many promises that I did in my career, including, by the way, for some of you will recognize, I'll mention this. I don't know if I've ever mentioned it before, but it'll put me in context here for some of you. I had asked, in coming into the government as a GS-18, for all the clearances my boss had. So I got a dozen clearances higher than top secret. SC, what now are called SCI, Sensitive Compartmented Information. We didn't use that term then, but special clearances. All right, not involved in, well, actually one involved, because one of these supposed bits of intelligence, the critical one, were intercepts for supposedly of attacks that had been, showing that the North Vietnamese had conducted an attack on August 4th on our destroyer patrol. And there were such intercepts. They did, however, refer to August 2nd, the attack that had taken place in daylight 2 days earlier, not August 4th, the night of August 4th. That was misleadingly, lyingly, told to Congress in 1968 by McNamara in closed testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, in which he had asked that nobody who did not have a special clearance, a communications intelligence clearance, you remember SI, could stay in the room except the congressman. He allowed them. And he did not show them the date-time group, which would have indicated that this did not refer to August 4th. Total deception, that's in 68. And we got a undated declaration of war from Congress on the basis of the deception that I have just described, which I knew at the time. Now, it didn't occur to me even to expose that to Congress at that time because President Johnson was running against Senator Goldwater, Air Force General Reserve, who was running openly for an expanded war, even more than Johnson was planning, actually, and for use of nuclear weapons in Vietnam. So I wasn't about to undercut the president on that, even if it had occurred to me to break my promise to keep these secrets. And I mentioned the other clearances because, as some of you know, each of these involves a separate promise and a briefing and, in some cases, additional clearance procedures. So it didn't occur to me to break any of those promises. Although, looking back at it, if I may say, it might have occurred to me, I'm not aware that it ever occurred to anyone in those years, that by keeping silent, I was breaking the single oath that I had taken. These other promises, as you know, are not oaths, so help me God, or formalized oaths, although they're often called secrecy oaths. They're agreements, non-disclosure agreements as a contractual basis for your job, as happens in corporations and all over the place. The oath I had taken was the same one I took in the Marine Corps years earlier as a lieutenant and then as a first lieutenant, and that I took later in the State Department and had just taken in the Defense Department. The oath that every congressional member, every member of Congress takes the same, every officer in the armed services takes the same oath, same words, every member of the executive branch takes the same oath, except the president, whose words are slightly different, but the substance is the same. And it is not an oath to secrecy, and it is not an oath to the president. It is not a Führer oath, as the SS had to take, and eventually all the German armed services, a blood oath to the leader. It's solely an oath to defend and support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And Article 1, Section 8 gives the power of getting us into a war, declare war, but really the intent was anything but a response to an immediate attack on our forces was to be made solely by Congress, not by consultation with Congress and advice of Congress, but by Congress. And lying to the Congress, as was done, to get a declaration of war, what amounted to a declaration of war, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution 3 days later, was a direct violation of that oath by the president, his words, I believe, are protect and preserve the Constitution. Every one of us who kept our mouths shut to Congress about that, including me and 1,000 others who knew the truth at that time, was violating their oath of office. And as Senator Morse, one of the 2 senators who voted against the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, in part because it was a resolution, because it was an unconstitutional usurpation of power by the executive. It followed no hearings, no advice, no consultation, no discussion in Congress. It was unconstitutional and aggression, said Morse. Pretty much what Barbara Lee, who I'm going to be talking to in a couple days, was the single member of Congress against the authorization for the use of military force at the time of Afghanistan and later Iraq, which all the presidents since have been relying on, and which presumably in some way is it conceivable that President Trump will rely on that for Syria? Yeah, it's conceivable. We don't know yet what he'll refer to as the basis for his unconstitutional behavior. But in any case, we were clearly keeping our mouths shut in a way that was violating that oath. Did I realize that at the time, 64? Definitely not. But well before this dilemma that they come to me. And I want to talk to you in a moment later, but not right now, about what I had learned in 61. And now we come to 71, but actually 69, if I may say, where I began copying the Pentagon Papers with a new president that I knew was giving the impression that he was getting us out of Vietnam, and I believe intended to get us out of Vietnam quickly in his first year. That's Richard Nixon. I don't think he was lying when he said, I'm going to end that war fast. And he said, with honor. but he didn't tell us what honor meant to him or what his conditions were for meeting that requirement. And I was sure in '69, having worked for the White House before the inauguration at the Pierre in December, and then in the White House, the Executive Office building, in early '69, I was aware that Nixon was not going to get us out of Vietnam, though he thought he was. He was making threats, including threats of nuclear war, which were secret from the public and which he thought would end the war quickly. And I was sure would not end the war and would lead only to a prolonged war and escalation, and eventually nuclear war, I feared. So that was the dilemma I was now facing. The prolongation, as the sentence says there, of an unjustified, wrongful, hopeless war, and a war that I had just come to realize in '69 had been illegitimate and wrongful from the start, something I did not appreciate in my 2 years in Vietnam, in the Foreign Service. I had the notion, not unlike that of Reagan or Carter, who called it a noble cause that had cost too much, that had not been carried out well, it was, fated not to resume. But it was only when I read the origins of that war in the Pentagon Papers, in the earliest chapters of it, which I put off till '69 to read, that I realized that an effort to provide the entire financial support, 80% of the financial support of a French effort to reconquer by force a former colony that had declared its independence on 1945. For an American, that was not a noble cause. It was not a legitimate cause. It was not what I had understood I was joining when I went to Vietnam. When I read the top secret history, what they were saying to themselves, I realized that that's what it was, that it was a wrongful war. And that meant that everybody killed there, in my opinion, on both sides, civilian and military, was being unjustifiably killed. Unjustifiable homicide. And in my layman's mind here, not making fine distinctions about that international lawyers would make, that read to me as murder, that I should not be part of at all. There was no way I could end it quickly, but I could stop cooperating with it quickly, and it's thought that's what I needed to do. And what's new in this book is, as the first sentence indicates, I also was aware that we had been for many years at that point, 70 years now really, in a buildup of nuclear weapons that was supported by secrecy and lies from the very beginning, and that had built up to a level that for a long time, and well by 461, into a doomsday machine. I didn't know about nuclear winter in 1969, not till 1983. So I didn't have that in my mind, but I did know, and we'll get back to that later, that I didn't know that it would threaten all life on Earth, which it does, but that it would mean the destruction of the Northern Hemisphere, of civilization in the Northern Hemisphere. I knew that by then. I thought the Southern Hemisphere would survive. Wrong. It was a mistake. But the Northern Hemisphere. So we had continued war like now, the Iraq, Afghanistan, very similar in their prospects to Vietnam, essentially the same. Other involvements going on in Somalia and Sudan and support in Yemen. But in Iraq and Afghanistan, Afghanistan in particular, an almost replay of the Vietnam War, but now with very heavy reliance on drones and surveillance and airplanes and much less loss of American life, but a lot of loss of Afghan life. And at the same time, a modernization of a doomsday machine going on. That was true in '69, it's true today. And it was true in '81, it was, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I faced, that was the dilemma I faced. And at that point, now, a crucial thing, having realized all that, was to meet young Americans who were on their way to prison for refusing to participate in a wrongful war. And that put the question in my head for the first time, What can I now do to help shorten this war now that I'm ready to go to prison? And actually, the first thoughts I had didn't really threaten prison. That didn't seem the most effective thing to do, but they would have ended my career, and that's in a way the operative question. What can I do to change matters if I'm ready to risk my career? That's the subject, in a way, today of the overall subject of ethics, and is faced by people who have been or will be in the government. Under what conditions should you consider breaking your promise to keep secrets, which most people don't consider? It's a promise, it's a commitment, it's national security. The risks of doing so are significant, but far from the risks. It's a matter of identity. I keep secrets for the president. I'm trusted with them. He's trusted, or she has trusted me with them. There's no question of breaking that for most people.
And you've said yourself that the Pentagon Papers, after you leaked them, they accomplished nothing, because Nixon was, of course, reelected in a landslide. He continued bombing, and you have said that you felt like they really had no impact. So
Yeah.
what did all of the trauma that you and your family went through, what did it accomplish in your mind?
Well, you're right. You've read that, and most people are not aware that my judgment is that the impact on the war of putting out the Pentagon Papers looked, as of a year and a half later with the Christmas bombing of Hanoi, zero. Pentagon Papers came out in June 13th. I was indicted at the end of that month of 1971, eventually faced 115 years in prison. The trial was still on in December of 1972 when we were bombing Hanoi, after an election, a landslide election, after Watergate had been revealed by Bernstein and Woodward and others, Cy Hirsch and others, a landslide victory for Nixon. And weeks after, Henry Kissinger, in his first publicly televised statement, because he had been forbidden to reveal his German accent on television, little known fact, until then. But they allowed him to say in his accent, which I won't try to imitate, well, particularly, before the election, peace is at hand, knowing that soon after the election was scheduled the heaviest bombing in human history, in 2 weeks of December of 1972. So when I was asked during that, I say, people said, what have the Pentagon Papers accomplished? And my answer was, nothing. The entire anti-war movement of which I was part, and which had inspired me to do this by the people who were going to prison for draft resistance, had led to this. 72 saw the heaviest bombing of the war with an offensive of 72, ending with the Christmas bombing. So I said, the American people have as much influence over their foreign policy at this moment as the Russian people had over the invasion of Hungary or Czechoslovakia. And I didn't see any distinction. Now, the war did come to an end, and in the end, it turned out that actions against me actually played a significant role in getting Nixon out of office, which was essential to ending the war. The anti-war movement couldn't end that war, whatever the Vietnamese did, and the anti-war movement, with Nixon in office, that war was scheduled to continue in the air till he left office. And no one foresaw that he would leave office in 1975 as 74. Okay. My wedding anniversary is August 8th, and on August 8th of 74, we were having dinner, and Nixon had just announced his resignation the next day. Somebody sent over, paid for my meal, actually, anonymously, and a bottle of champagne, again, anonymously. And, the next day. So who foresaw that in 72? Zero. Not one person could have imagined. And that meant to me, remember the Pentagon Papers, 71, landslide election, 72. Ask me whether the war will end before 1977. Zero. That is not going to happen. I was wrong. And so it did happen. Miracles can happen, in effect, and there have been others in my life. But that's the answer to your question. Initially, big effect on public opinion, very big, but the public was already against the war, primarily. It increased the majority against the war. It did not significantly increase the vote for the McGovern-Hatfield bill, which was to cut off funding for the war, which Congress could do last year, the year before, whatever, on Iraq, Afghanistan, haven't come close to it, Democrat or Republican. Could they stop him in terms of funding from attacking North Korea? Yes, in the absence of an immediate attack for which he's to repel. Congress could say, no money shall be expended for an attack on North Korea without a declaration of war by Congress. And there is a bill right now, I was just discussing with one of its sponsors, for no use of nuclear weapons except in a war declared by Congress. There's 66 co-sponsors, I think. That ain't enough to get it, and it won't get it. Congress is not going to stop this war that we're on the verge of right now. So, but depending on papers, to my disappointment, didn't even do what Nixon expected. Increase the vote for the McGovern-Hatfield bill as long as there were soldiers at risk in Vietnam. Not until the soldiers got out was Congress ready to cut off the funds. But then they did do it, not knowing actually what they were doing at that time, how effective it was. They eventually cut off all the funding for combat operations at a time we weren't conducting any, not knowing that Nixon intended to renew the bombing and did not do so because of Watergate, and basically because of the break-in to my former psychoanalyst office, at which point he rescinded his order of April 15th to return the bombing, according to Time magazine. So I was going to have a fight for impeachment, as this president is facing right now, by the way, and did not want to have an additional fight on the bombing issue. So he rescinded the order to continue the bombing in the expectation, resume it, in the expectation that it would come back to that later, and he never got to it because he was later facing impeachment and had to resign, which made the war endable 9 months later. So it turned out, and this is so much in line with what we're talking about, you're talking about effects. What I did worried the president that I would reveal information about his threats against North Vietnam and his threats of escalation. I was talking about them, but I didn't have documents because the people who had those documents and who resigned over Cambodia, 5 members of the NSC staff resigned over Cambodia, 1 consultant, did not take any documents with them and did not reveal them. Nixon feared they could have given them to me. And so he had to send people into doctor's office to get information to blackmail me into silence, not to reveal and smear me. People said that was to stigmatize me. I was already facing 12 felony counts in a federal court. Stigmatizing me was not the problem at that point. But information that he thought he could find that I didn't want out about myself, that in those days it would have been homosexual. Now, not. It would have to be something more lurid than that. But something that I didn't want out, that he could threaten to put out and keep me silent. And then when they didn't find anything there in the files that they broke into, by the way, that file they broke into is here in town now in the Smithsonian. Dr. Fielding's file cabinet is broken into, is in the Smithsonian. And they didn't find that, so he had to do other things. I was heard on warrantless wiretaps of Mort Halpern and Tony Lake and others that were then criminal. Then a dozen CIA assets were brought up from Miami on May 3rd, 1972, to incapacitate Daniel Ellsberg totally. And when the prosecutor, William Merrill, told me that, I said, what does that mean? Kill me? And he said, the words were to incapacitate you totally. But you have to understand, he said, these guys, CIA people, never use the word kill. neutralize, terminate with extreme prejudice, this and that. They don't talk. So he thought it was to kill me. I think not. I think it was to keep me quiet about what I was talking about, the coming mining of Haiphong, which, by the way, might have destroyed Russian ships in Haiphong. And been impressive to the Russians, Nixon thought. That wasn't a negative, that was a positive.
So all of that said, how would you encourage a new generation of whistleblowers to come forward, given everything that you went through?
Exactly. What I'm saying is that the fact that there was an effect was like a miracle. Many things had to come together to make it possible to face him with resignation. And certainly that was not in my mind at all when I did this in the first instance. And the fact that it happened was at that time astonishing. Nothing like that. It was kind of a miracle. So I can't say to other people, do this, do that, reveal. And you have a good chance of having a big effect. I wouldn't say that was true, actually. It's not clear yet whether Chelsea Manning will have had a big effect, or Ed Snowden. A lot of discussion in Congress of surveillance and a lot more knowledge, and many, many resolutions passed about reining in NSA, National Security Agency. I, by the way, spent some time with Ed in Moscow trying to find out how many clearances he'd had. It was almost uncountable. But any effect? Has it affected what NSA is actually doing? Not clear. Will it ever? Not clear. So there's no guarantee at all, no matter how much discussion you get going. But you can't say impossible. In my case, the way I think of it right now, I would not have done what I did without the example, very specifically, of Bob Eaton of American Friends Service Committee, Randy Keeler, both Gandhians, followers of Martin Luther King, who chose to go to prison and put in my head the idea, what could I do now that I'm not afraid of going to prison like them or giving up my career? So I wouldn't have done that without their example. I'm very pleased that Ed Snowden, I think Chelsea is too young, actually, Ed wasn't much older to have known about me, but he said that he had seen the movie Most Dangerous Man in America, Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers, which was nominated for an Oscar for longest title for a documentary. And I was told just yesterday, you are no longer the most dangerous man in America, Donald Trump. I see that. But the reason Henry Kissinger had called me that was the danger that I would tell the truth about what Nixon, Kissinger's boss, was doing in the way of nuclear threats. That's why I worried them. And if I hadn't worried them, they wouldn't have taken the then criminal acts to shut me up. It's very noticeable that after 9/11, and here's the discouraging part, all of the crimes that Nixon did against me, which were the major aspect of his impeachment process, are now legal or have been legalized, even whether or not you can make them constitutional. Warrantless wiretaps, no problem, as Snowden has found after the Patriot Act and other things. Going into a doctor's office by CIA, acting as domestic intelligence, no problem after the Patriot Act. How about bringing 12 people up to incapacitate me totally, American citizen, on the steps of the Capitol on May 3rd? Barack Obama sent drones to kill an American citizen born in this country, Anwar al-Awlaki, without due process, without indictment, without anything. Deliberate attempt, effort to kill him on a kill list, which he looked at regularly, which had other Americans on it too. And as far as we know, that list did not include Awlaki's born in America 16-year-old son, but he was killed a few weeks later by a drone in a way that's, for reasons never explained, perhaps some kind of mistake. But other people going after somebody else on a kill list. Okay, so what that means to me is that presidents now feel entitled, and Barack Obama was not, for whom I voted twice, was not challenged on this, to kill American citizens. without due process. So in all these cases, a president would no longer have to obstruct justice by paying off people like Howard Hunt or Gordon Liddy, further obstruction of justice, to keep them quiet, because they're not crimes anymore. So where do we come out? Had Alex Butterfield not broken, he didn't even have to take a promise. It was just inconceivable that he, as one of the handful of people who knew about the taping in the Oval Office and was in on every meeting, that he would reveal the taping to the Watergate Committee. Without that, I believe, Nixon would have stayed in office and the war would have continued. He was a Republican. His reasons for doing that, he went into with me to some extent. No one foresaw that. No one imagined that. That was after Dean's testimony about the plumbers and about the break-in. That was after my trial had ended. If Elliot Richardson had not refused to fire the special prosecutor, does that sound resonant at all here? It's in the news this afternoon. The president considering whether he will fire the special prosecutor and saying today that he wants the prosecutor's boss, Rosenstein, to fire him. And then he's mad at Sessions, Rosenstein's boss, for not firing, et cetera, et cetera. If Richardson had not refused to do that and then followed by Ruckelshaus, who succeeded him, who also refused and resigned till we got to Bork, who did it, Nixon would have stayed in office. Simply, I think, without that evidence. It would have been Dean against the president. And the president was in those days believed. And we now have a president who's believed by at least 35, 37%, whatever he says. Absolutely. So similar, today is happening, all of this. Unless those people had done what was not expected of them, what risked their careers, definitely, or gave them up, what took risk of, in some cases, well, we had the number 2 man in the FBI, Mark Felt, acting as deep throat, breaking all of his promises, for which he could have been prosecuted. He was prosecuted later for other things. But for this, he could have been prosecuted, acting as deep throat. Without all of those people, Nixon would have stayed in office and the war would have continued. But they did do it. So I think of myself as one link in a chain of people, saying that no one could have foreseen any of this. Randy Keeler, my friend, who went to prison, has been my friend ever since, and very strong against nuclear weapons as well in the Freeze campaign, told me just recently what had induced him to be willing to go to prison. Something he'd read and some people who induced him. So there's this long chain of people, and the answer is an act out of the ordinary at personal risk can have a very big effect. And where enormous stakes are at issue, the Constitution, a continued war, nuclear war, a war's worth of lives, it is worth it to consider taking any personal risk on this. Thank you.
I wonder how you feel at this moment about the press being an intermediary for leakers, essentially being a platform for leakers, because we see the press being denigrated every day by this president. And I wonder if you think that that undermines the credibility of any kind of leaks that would come out and the credibility of a whistleblower, or if you start to envision a WikiLeaks type platform as perhaps the best way to get these leaks out there, or do you still have faith that people will trust in the press and the leakers who choose to go to them?
Good questions. I've long been asked, what would I do now with this sort of information? I would still go to the print press, first of all, to get the documents printed because, well, I don't know, in my old age here, I still read the print press a lot more, and in Washington, and it prints large amounts of stuff, hard for me to read on a computer. So I would go to the print press first, as did a guy named Tam, who revealed just what he'd heard. He didn't have documents about the NSA criminal program of surveillance, of warrantless wiretaps, and warrant surveillance and everything. which he gave to James Risen and others, Thomas Tam, for which he was facing trial for a very long time. Now, here's the other thing, though. Snowden did not go to the Times. By the way, Chelsea Manning did and was ignored, and did go to the Post first before she went to WikiLeaks. But Snowden did not go to the Times because he had observed that when Tam and others went to the Times with this vast program of criminality here and unconstitutional behavior, the Times, above the Risen level, Bill Keller sat on it for a year. After he was told by the White House, you'll have blood on your hands, meaning we will accuse you of blood on your hands if there's another terrorist attack that we will say could have been prevented by this. And he held off. And that was in October of 2004. Is that right? Yeah, 4. Which meant that he refrained from having the evidence they had, which, by the way, was a lot of testimony, but not documents, about giving the lie to George W. Bush, who had said, we do not listen to American citizens without a warrant. A flat lie. And revealing that would have had a very big effect, undoubtedly, or a significant effect, on a very close election in 2004. So Keller took the choice by a free press here and by the Times not to intervene in an election, and gave us 4 more years of George W. Bush, essentially, who won, if you'll remember, by very disputed votes in Ohio in that year, a very close margin. So I think that Bill Keller deserved the Pulitzer Prize he got a year later for publishing Risen's work, and should have been impeached, the equivalent of it journalistically, for having held on to it. Well, Snowden, having observed that, chose not to go to the Times, and instead put it out through reporters that he trusted more, Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras. Again, that's what I would say. First, go to the print press. If they don't wait a year, as all the people who had talked to the Times did wait. They knew about this unconstitutional behavior enormously. Listen to all Americans, like the East German Stasi. The Times wasn't printing it. They'd talk to the Times, and a year went by. And by the way, the reason it came out at all was that Risen decided he would put it out in a book himself, and the Times, in order not to be scooped by their own reporter, chose to put it out under his byline. Risen has said publicly many times, no chance the Times would have printed that if they didn't know he was going to put it out in a book. So, you know, it's a mixed picture here. And now you're getting to the immediate problem. Supposing they did put it out now, or, you know, what I gave them or whatever, would it be believed? And that is something interestingly new. I would say that the chance of its getting printed, even by print press, with documents is pretty good. They didn't have documents from Risen. Risen didn't have documents. Snowden put out documents, and he got as much attention as you could want. And, you know, it got out all over everywhere with the documents. They printed them. And he's in lifetime exile. And I've said enough here, I'll add this to it. When Snowden was being searched for by the CIA and NSA, turned out to be in Hong Kong, revealed himself to Laura Poitras, but they were looking for him. And I said publicly that he was in physical danger, in my opinion. That if they could knock him off and stop this flow, there would be a real danger that would happen. And this was under Barack Obama. So I believe it was the Atlantic, it so happens, your paper, that actually had a column saying, Ellsberg is really going off the rails on this. You know, here this shows off the wall, extreme historian. So how could he imagine such a thing, you know? And I didn't say I didn't put it into print, but I told people at the time, and you'll say, you're talking to a person who had 12 people brought up from Miami with orders from the White House to incapacitate me totally. And that was in 1972. And I was at that point under trial. I'd been on trial for a year at that point. I was one of the most prominent people in America. That didn't protect me from this. So don't tell me that I have no right to say that Snowden is in danger now. And I think he really was. And he will be, for the rest of his life, really. That's the way it is. And I think he did do the right thing, absolutely. But now, with the documents this year, would they be believed? And you've really pointed to something new, actually. Even with the documents, people will say, if this president says, those are forged, that didn't happen. You know, none of this is true. About a third of Americans will believe that, despite the documents. And, you know, in the new digital age, and you could say it could be true also, you know, the possibility for falsification is indeed great. So it wouldn't be as clear-cut. I come back to the same point. The chance of having an effect on actual policy is small, actually small, but it's not zero. And where the stakes are very high, your own personal life can absolutely be worth taking that risk.
On that note, we're going to open it up to questions. I think there's going to be someone with a microphone walking around. But that gentleman all the way in the back had his hand up first.
Dan, Howard Moreland here.
I may have to have you repeat this because my hearing is terrible.
There's a lot of comparison between Trump and Nixon. One thing I've noticed that was different, back in Nixon's day, I recall only one person in the major media who was openly critical of Nixon, and that was Tommy Smothers. And he got into a whole bunch of trouble with CBS for it. Nowadays, Stephen Colbert, every night, tells more nasty Trump jokes than Tommy Smothers did against Nixon in his whole career. And to me, that seems like a difference, but it's not having an effect on Trump's supporters. And I wonder if it really is a different atmosphere when it's so openly possible to criticize the president.
Could you give me a little? I heard about half of that, but can you help me?
So I think what you're asking is whether or not the media should feel more free to criticize the president. Is that right? Or
does the difference between Stephen Colbert and Tommy Smothers really mean that we have a different atmosphere in the country today?
Certainly, what's unique almost is the president using his bully pulpit to say, don't believe what you're reading in the press. I don't remember a precedent for that, and the fake news story and everything. In terms of criticism of the president, there is no lack of that in the press at this point, in terms of mocking him in very strong terms and satirizing in various ways. Of course, Nixon felt that too at the time, though people have forgotten he wasn't all that unpopular when he got a landslide election. He wasn't elected by 37% or 40% or something in 1972. And that was before, you know, he was really facing his downfall. But still, people were free to satirize and criticize. It's, you know, look, the headline tonight is, what I saw, we're talking today now, is, who was it? Somebody saying, Trump will face, it will be suicide. Some high member of Congress said it would be suicidal. I think Grassley said that. Be suicide for him to fire Mueller. You know, we're back in the same situation of firing, you know, Archibald Cox, basically, in 72. It would be suicidal for him to do that. That did result in what was called, it was the Saturday Night Massacre, because it was not just Cox who was fired, it was Richardson had to resign and Ruckelshaus. So he had 3 people leaving in one night, and that got what was called a firestorm of protest. I think an unprecedented outpouring of telegrams and calls and whatnot to them that forced them to do what Nixon had no further prior intention to do, and that was to appoint a new special prosecutor. Now, in a way, would that happen again? Well, would there be protest? Yes, I have no doubt of that. There will be enormous protest. It might even be, as I was told by a congressperson today, hours ago, enormous outpouring in the streets. But will it make a difference? A difference was at that time that the president was doing this facing a Democratic Congress, both House and Senate. Clinton faced impeachment from a Republican House and Senate, I believe, in '98. That's not the case now. Will the Republicans then turn on their president if he fires Mueller? I don't know, but let me just make a guess. No, actually. And I heard from another congressman that they don't have the spine to do it. But I think, is that just Democrats? Is that just Republicans? I remember after 2006, I was very excited when the Democrats took the House in 2006 because Conyers of the Senate Judiciary Committee, head of it, had written a book that summer on impeaching Bush, who certainly deserved George W. Bush impeachment, in part for not other things, but in particular for a totally unconstitutional, aggressive war, which we're still fighting in Iraq. And so he had all these articles of impeachment a year. So I said, aha, I'd been telling people all summer, vote for the Democrats because John Conyers will be the head of the Judiciary Committee, which is what brings impeachment to the House. Well, didn't happen. And in part, in considerable part, was the Democratic leadership was afraid that would bring Republicans to the polls, and they couldn't get a Democratic president in 2008. So it made almost no difference to have the Democrats in. And I remember saying to Senator Gravel, who had faced censure for putting the Pentagon Papers in the congressional record one night, just before I was indicted, I said, Mike, is this Congress unusually cowardly? And he said, no, usually cowardly. He said, they were just the same then. It hasn't changed. I don't think it has changed. I don't think we're in a world now where people will impeach a president of their own party. It hasn't happened. So I think Trump could get away with that.
You in the blue?
Hi, Dr. It's working. I anchor for the Voice of America and I anchor for the Voice of America in Westwood One, and I'm teaching a course on the Pentagon Papers. In fact, tomorrow is the second class. We had John Prados at the first class. We were going to have Mary come to the class tomorrow, but she wasn't able to make it. Your daughter Mary. Your daughter Mary.
My daughter Mary?
Yeah, she was going to come to the class, but she wasn't able to make
Wait
it.
a minute,
So
what's the matter here?
So
she gave me a birthday party just on Saturday.
right. So if you want to be a backup to Mary, we'd love to. We'd love to have you tomorrow.
Wait, I think I can get married to your...
Okay, all right, we'll see. My question is, we're told that you provided the papers to Neil Sheehan, but there is an account that he and his wife photocopied them without your permission.
Yeah.
Is that true?
That is true. I had told him that he had access to the papers. I even gave him a key to the apartment where they were being kept so that he could take notes on them. It was my wife's brother, half-brother. But I had said to him, I didn't want them to publish. Wait, let me get this right here. I told him, you don't have my permission to copy them. That was it. Until I have some indication that the Times is thinking seriously about publishing them. I'm not asking for a guarantee. I know that could change the night before publication, and it almost did, by the way, on the question of publishing the documents or not. But I said, I'd like to know that they're serious about it. My fear was that if I gave him copies, they would be numbers of copies in the Xerox age around the Times. They wouldn't do it in the end, but somebody would pick up the phone to the FBI and call for those copies. So I said I wanted to know that they really were interested in it. And for reasons still not clear to me, he not only refrained from telling me that they were working night and day, as shown in the movie on this, he told me the opposite, actually. He said they weren't working on it. That's why I went to Senator Mathias and Representative McCloskey and McGovern, others, Fulbright, trying to get them out otherwise. And I'm not sure to this day why he misled me on that point. But what he did do was to, in having promised not to copy them, did use the key and brought his wife up and went out and got money from the Times and copied them. And when I learned that afterwards, when I was on trial, I never held that against him, actually, at all. He had done pretty much what I'd done. He thought, these things have to come out, whether this guy is willing or not, and so forth. He was ready to risk that the Times wouldn't do it, but that he would have the copy anyway. And he knew they were interested. So that wasn't an issue which he chose not to tell me. So I really didn't hold that against him, actually, but that is the case. And as far as Mary is concerned, Spielberg was very taken by the story of my daughter's involvement in the papers, and he actually had a scene which ended up on the cutting room floor, where I knew she was going to be in the movie. There was a night when my son, who was then 13, was working the Xerox machine, and I was collating, and Mary, who was then 10, was cutting Top Secret off the top and bottoms of the pages with the scissors. And so in the movie, in the end, they had Tony Russo cutting the Top Secret because Spielberg said it was just incredible. No one would believe it. And he said I would have to spend too much time explaining why I had done this. So in the end, there was an earlier version of this story in which my daughter was shown with, we were just discussing this, with blonde hair. So I had told the producers, since they were putting this scene in, her hair is black. It's got to be black. And she ended up not coming. But I think I can get her in the studio for you there.
In the red? We'll go.
Talk to me afterward.
I'm Bill Gatesman. I'm a lawyer in private practice. Thank you, Mr. Ellsberg. You started out by referring, you referred to your oath to the Constitution as the basis that allows, at least for your mind, whatever.
Yeah. Not at the time, by the way. I didn't think of that at the time.
But in
later.
retrospect, you did. And then you also went through the history, and you show how these fundamental laws are being compromised with the Patriot Act and so on. And the question arose, for what advice do you give people who might now be considering being a whistleblower with the erosion of these fundamental laws? What basis then would someone refer to when making this very consequential decision to leak?
When they feel that their silence, they should consider doing it. When they feel that their silence would be wrongfully helping to sentence many, many, many people of various colors and nationalities to death, or the Constitution, which is being violated, was being further shredded, as Ed Snowden did feel, for example. And there were, in other words, enormous stakes. And that the president is lying about this and wrongfully leading the country. Then I think they should, what I would tell them is, don't do what I did. Don't wait till the bombs are falling or nuclear war has occurred in North Korea before you consider revealing estimates in the Pentagon of just what the prospects are in North Korea. I have no doubt that there are top secret, confidential, and unclassified reports in the Pentagon right now, and higher than top secret, that say that war with North Korea would have the following effects, properly described as catastrophic, and that it could not possibly serve American interests to do this. Well, I would consider putting that out at whatever cost to myself, and I mean tonight or tomorrow. And if I had access to the 6,000 pages of the top secret but redacted torture report that Barbara Feinstein said should be out, I would certainly consider putting that out of significant importance enough to do so. So there's lots of things. And there's lots of things that it wouldn't occur to me to put out, and nobody that I knew would occur to me, occur to put out. Revealing Valerie Plame's name to punish her husband, Joe Wilson, and to revealing that she was a covert agent involved in countering proliferation, something that has to be done and has to be done secretly. And to put that out by, what was his name, Scooter Libby, at the directions of Cheney and others, was wrong. And I can't imagine doing that, or others, but for political purposes, that sort of thing is done. So there are secrets that certainly should be kept, and there are secrets where you give the benefit of the doubt to the president if you have doubts about it, and that's something that passes across your desk every day if you're in the national security business. But, and then there are secrets which this should be out. And that's where most people have not had the benefit that I did of a direct face-to-face example with someone who seems like yourself and is choosing to go to prison.
Can we get someone in the back, actually? Oh, back there. Gentleman, yeah.
A lot of what you say has a sense of hopelessness about it, in effect. Going back to Vietnam, what effect do you think there was about the younger generation confronting their parents over the issue of Vietnam? And does that have any relationship today and any hopeful sign of change? We saw the March for Our Lives a couple of weeks ago that perhaps is a start of that example.
Well, if I understand you correctly, and again, correct me if I missed something. Again, I heard about half of it, I'm sorry. But I think you're referring to the marches we've seen just in the last week or two about gun control. Was that something in your mind? And I must say that when I first heard of those, I thought, very nice, I'm glad to see it happening, but we'll see what happens as a result, until I learned that all the young speakers were talking about registering other people to vote and getting them registered and going into the process this year, which struck me as not only as very, very good objective and motivation, not significant, not enough. As I said, as I've been saying, you can elect new people in there and they don't necessarily act any different from the old ones, but it's necessary. It gives you a chance. And I don't recall, with all the respect I had for the Occupy movement, which I addressed several people in the streets with policemen standing by, I don't recall them talking at all about registering or voting. On the contrary, there was a contempt for it. There's no difference between the parties. This is a useless process. It's not sufficient, but it's essential. And frankly, in the anti-war movement as a whole, back in the 60s, which I was a belated member of, there wasn't much talk about Congress or about, the idea was affecting the president somehow. And as I've said, the effect on the president was like zero. But there could have been much more effect on Congress than there actually was. They hadn't focused on it. So if the young people are focusing on changing Congress this year and in 2020, that makes me very hopeful. And when you said, by the way, hopelessness, when I heard you say that, I thought, gee, could I have said more often that I feel there is a chance? The chance is low. If I said I thought the chance of dismantling the doomsday machine, which is the objective of this book, is high or certain, I would be lying. And I'm not inclined to lie, to inspire people. I think the chance is very low, but it's not zero. And I've mentioned the miracle of the ending of the war in 1975. The Berlin Wall coming down in 1989. I don't know of one person who would have foreseen that in 1984 as possible. We didn't talk about it at all. Reagan actually did say, take down that wall, and everybody said, yeah, right, and total rhetoric. Didn't even pay any attention to that idea. Had it come up, the answer would have been not what I've been saying, the chance is low. It's impossible. That's ridiculous. Nelson Mandela coming to office, which didn't produce heaven on earth or total equality or anything, but no one foresaw that happening without violence. I remember Tony Lewis saying in the New York Times, it is impossible to imagine something close to this. Nelson Mandela or the ANC coming to power without violence, which he was not proposing, but he said it's not going to happen. It did happen. So I'm old enough to tell young people and people not so young, you can't say impossible. You can't say impossible here. And so I'm working with a very thin margin here, but the chance of increasing that slightly is worth it. I think it's worth a person's life. And when you come to register, it doesn't amount to that much. But I must say, by the way, I have friends, oh boy, this would be so controversial in some audiences, but I'm very impatient with my friends who were not willing to vote for Hillary Clinton because she was so bad, and even when the alternative was Donald Trump. And Jill Stein, or not voting, or whatever, I really held that against them at the time, and in retrospect, even more. So happens, as I have ever since Ralph Nader in 2000. And so it's essential. I think their heads are in the sand. That showed to me, since I've almost never met somebody who regrets having voted for Ralph Nader in 2000, which showed me that there is as much opportunity for denial on the left as anywhere else.
This gentleman in the second row, right here.
Yeah, here, right here.
Yeah.
Hello, C.M. Brown, formerly of the Rand Corporation.
Right, very good.
Hi, Dan.
Rand
And of Brookings and of the Carnegie Endowment, but now retired. I'd like to focus back on some of the issues that you raise in the Doomsday Machine, a very important
Have you seen it
book.
already?
I've read it,
Oh,
every
great.
page already. I have. Let's suppose that I'm a young official. Well, all right, use your imagination. Let's suppose I'm a young official in the Defense
You've dyed
Department.
your hair since I knew
That's
you.
right. Say at the level of a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. And I've been privy to, in fact, participating in the drafting of the Nuclear Posture Review.
You did, you say? I'm sorry?
I'm supposing that
yeah, right.
Imagine.
this is a supposition that I'm that kind of a young official, and I've been participating in it. And I realize that what this is in the large, despite some of the obscure rhetoric in the review itself, this is an effort to legitimize the nuclearization of the overall defense posture. Talk about dual capabilities in a lot of forces, variable yields, low yield weapons, and so on, nuclear weapons, that what's really going on is an effort to integrate nuclear weapons into the overall defense strategy and posture in a way that has not really been done up to now this much. That's really what's going on, and there's a new group of theorists who have influenced my colleagues in the Defense Department to plan for limited strategic nuclear war. Okay, that's really what the NPR does. Okay, and I know this. I've sat in these discussions. What should I do? Should I resign from the government because I regard this as a disastrous
This is
policy?
hypothetical. You're not in the government now.
No, I'm not. I'm not. I'm that kind of an individual who has discovered what you discovered back in the early 1960s. But now I realize that what's going on is putting us in a situation in which we could step into nuclear war, that the threshold of nuclear use would be lowered, not raised, that would be lowered, and that could put us on an escalator to nuclear holocaust, to the very things that you're talking about in your book. What should I do? Should I resign and join the anti-nuclear war movement? Should I go public, like you did? Or should I stay and attempt to work myself into a position of influence where possibly I can effect some reversal away from that disastrous policy of normalizing nuclear war. I have that choice facing me, that dilemma facing me. What would you advise?
Well, you know, that's where we started in my talk here, because that was the question posed in that review of my book. Suppose you're a young professional who recognizes what you just described, and you didn't mention the intervention part, but you're focusing on the nuclear part, which was what I focused on in my new book. By the way, how are we on time here? What's happening?
We have about 5 minutes.
Okay, I'd like to give a good answer to that if I could, because it's so central. I'm really pleased, CM, to have you in particular, but to be able to talk in Washington with people who've read my book, very few so far, and to have this discussion. You are asking the question that I would hope would come from reading it. And this, when I said this kind of audience, if you're not in the government, you know people who are in the government, who are in this position. Now, I would take issue with only one thing you've said, which is, well, first, I agree totally with you say that this NPR, in effect, doesn't just aim to legitimize or destigmatize first use and limited strategic use. They talk about even doing it in connection with cyber attacks. Haven't spelled out too much what that might be, but it does do that. But to say that that's new and unprecedented, I think a lot of people, I don't want to accuse you of this, but a lot of people have forgotten the George W. Bush administration already and Richard Cheney. The fact is that the 2002, I think it was 2000, something like that, various NPRs in the past have talked about expanding the first use of nuclear weapons in various cases, and not one has ever renounced the first use of nuclear weapons. Obama is said to have considered that strongly and asked for it to be considered, not only in 2010, perhaps 2013, but in his last year, 2016, very seriously, getting rid of the ICBMs, which I regard not just as anachronistic, but as the hair trigger to the doomsday machine, the use them or lose them aspect of the posture both on our side and the Russian side, which should have been sent out, should have been eliminated half a century ago, in my opinion, or every year since. But Obama wasn't able to get that past his Secretary of Defense, Ash Carter, who had been for that years earlier when he worked under his then mentor, William Perry, in the Defense Department. And now Ash Carter, as Secretary of Defense, is turning around and defending the ICBMs. William Perry called for no first use, has done that. General Cartwright has called for it. Obama called for it in the White House privately, and it was reported that he had done that and couldn't get it because of the opposition to it and the lack of support for it. So let me first take your first point there, or one of your points. Should you stay in and work it from the inside? People have had these good ideas for as long as I've been around, for 50 years and more, on this stuff, and it has had no perceptible effect. And I would say it's a very familiar thing to say, if I stay inside, surely my prospects for having some effect eventually are greater than I could possibly have on the outside. I think that's usually a delusion. It's not stupid, it's not crazy, but it very rarely works. The forces on the insiders and in the insiders have worked in this very steady, consistent direction, and the fact is that first-use threats and threats of demonstrative attacks, which we hear in Russia now as well, escalating to de-escalate, crazy then, crazy for us when we said it in NATO in the Berlin crisis all this time. It's crazy stuff, but it's very recurrent, and it wins. Because all the jobs and the profits, and this is one factor, the jobs and the profits and the votes and the retirement jobs that are waiting for people are all on the side of maintaining the doomsday machine. And I do not think that pressure from inside is ever going to do it. That would be my guess. It's only an estimate. But I could say it hasn't worked in the past. And how about it out from the outside? Well, I said over and over, no guarantee, not even a likelihood. But I think the chance is greater. Of what? Resigning? McNamara said, if I resigned, it would be a one-day story. Well, that's silly. Of course, it would be more than a one-day story. But if he just resigned without documents and without a persistent campaign to explain what he had said to the president about getting out of Vietnam, which he had said, and saying that to the public, no, it wouldn't have much effect. Without doing what I did, which he could have done without any danger of prosecution in his case. But that's the Secretary of Defense. Secretary of State, Powell, could have, I think, stopped the Iraq War, which allegedly he was against, without any danger of prosecution, but with a danger of career effects and image effects that he didn't want to incur. His aide, what's his name? Larry Wilkerson, yeah, his aide, Larry Wilkerson, said that in the run-up to Iraq, he had had a letter of resignation in his desk, which he took out and looked at every morning, and then put back. And I think he is not happy in a way, in the end. Now, on the question of the nuclear threats I've been talking about, Nixon had reason to believe that I did have documents on his nuclear threats, because people who knew them directly were friends of mine. I knew all of the 5 who resigned, Tony Lake, Mort Halpern as a consultant, Roger Morris, Watts, that's for somebody else. He had reason to think that they might have supplied me with what they knew of the nuclear threats. And Roger Morris in '69 now, when I'm facing this dilemma, when I started copying the papers, had seen the nuclear target folders in North Vietnam, just for a very limited nuclear strike that would kill an estimated number of civilians, 3. 3 civilians, a jungle post on the edge of China, and a transshipment point coming from China, high altitude, low yield, little bursts, the kind of thing we might do on the test sites in North Korea. That, of course, won't lead to anything more, because the other side will back off at that point. We can be almost sure. And he'd seen that. He'd seen the photos for them, and the Mujia Pass and so forth. He said to me later, they didn't put out any of that. He said to me later, Roger, we should have thrown open the safes and screamed bloody murder, because that's exactly what it was. What I'm saying then to this hypothetical person is, don't just resign, and don't stay in like Powell on the thought that eventually he'll listen to me and I will overpower. Put out the documents in your safe. Do it in testimony to Congress. What should Mattis do? Mattis, like me, is a Marine. He stayed in longer than I did on that. But that means he never had any dealings with nuclear weapons. The Marines didn't have any nuclear weapons. They had 10-inch howitzers, which in the Lebanon crisis, for example, they were dependent on nuclear weapons. I am sure he is not wedded to the idea of nuclear weapons. He knows he's looking at a 2-sided nuclear war, not nuclear winter, but just several million, not billions, but millions dead. There's been a lot of discussion now of what he will do, or what he might do if he gets an order that he doesn't agree with. Well, they say, well, if it's unlawful, unfortunately, he won't do it. Yeah, fat chance. But the order is to attack North Korea missile sites with non-nuclear weapons and their warhead testing site, non-nuclear, very accurate cruise missiles, kill almost no civilians. unless a few happened to be inspecting it at the time, with the expectation that Kim Jong-un, very good expectation, will respond with some monstrous act. I'm not sure what Kim Jong-un can do that isn't rather monstrous in the way of killing civilians in South Korea. But he uses his artillery against Seoul, he does this or that. He may even before long be using nuclear weapons that kill millions of civilians. That will then justify our annihilating North Korea, as the president is doing. And having demonstrated that Kim Jong-un is so monstrous, as we've just seen, thank God we didn't wait 2 years for him to get H-bombs and ICBMs. The president was right, after all, to prepare and threaten and commit and wipe out this regime that was so monstrous. Now, what if Mattis foresees that coming? By the way, I think Trump would get away with that. I think that if he can provoke a monstrous act from Kim Jong-un, which I would guess he can do, I think he would get away, even if we suffered extreme casualties as a result. Our old corporation, the Rand Corporation, did a study in 2006, the year that they first tested a weapon, as to what Kim Jong, it was his father then, would do with a container on a boat that he sent with a nuclear device in it that he sent to San Francisco Harbor, or in that case, Long Beach Harbor. 65,000 immediate casualty deaths, 250,000 within weeks from radiation. That's what he could do in 2006. That's what he could do right now. He doesn't need an ICBM. And what if that happened? What would happen with Trump? Trump would have saved us from an ICBM and an H-bomb in various things. I just make an estimate here, very speculative, what if? I think he'd get away with that. And by the way, with the first attacks on that, which could be tomorrow in Syria, but I don't think that's enough for the following action, or a war with North Korea, Mueller is fired the hour of that attack. It's a tiny item in an inside page, no problem. I think that if he wants to get rid of Mueller, he needs a war, and he can have it. Okay, supposing then I was in a position, whether I was a Secretary of Defense or a secretary to the Secretary of Defense, and I'd seen the estimates, and I'd talked to people, and I had a good understanding of where this was going. Then I would say the public needs to know this, Congress needs to know this. They may go along with it, but let it be their responsibility. Let it be Congress's responsibility, the majority party and the minority party. And I would say, do what Ed Snowden did or Chelsea Manning did, and not what I did in '61 or '64, which was to stay in office and keep my promise. I would consider breaking that promise and informing the world of where we were heading, toward hell. And whether it would have any effect or not, who knows, but it's worth trying. That's the answer. Thank you.
Gotta leave it there. Well, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. And Dan's book is for sale out in the lobby, and it's 15% off. And it's a fantastic read, so I recommend that you all buy it. Thank you. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.